Just over 5 years ago, waves of unrest erupted across North Africa and the Middle East. The so-called Arab Spring began in Tunisia, and soon mass protests, like those in Cairo's Tahrir Square, spread across the region. The revolt led to the fall of longtime leaders: President Mubarak of Egypt, Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, President Ben Ali of Tunisia, and President Saleh of Yemen. The uprisings promised much, but some of the countries that experienced Arab Spring protests, like Syria and Yemen, are now mired in war. We begin with CCTV correspondent Yasser Hakim, who joins us from Egypt, Cairo. Yasser, you're in Cairo, which was, of course, a major part of the Arab Spring uprising playing out. Hundreds killed, the fall of the President Hosni Mubarak, then the ouster of his successor, Mohamed Morsi. How is the Arab Spring being viewed there 5 years on, sir?
Well, Nathan, the problem is that the Arab Spring, when it happened, the expectations were very high, but there's now kind of a mix between the people here, whether it's been a success or not. If you look at the political side, the elections and political activities are much open now than before during the Mubarak era, or before Mubarak as well. And also, there's a lot of media attention, media freedom, if you compare it to before. But one thing that has marred this is the economy. The Egyptians and most of the people in the region have suffered economically very much after the Springs, the Arab Springs, because of the political unrest, because of the violence. And therefore there's no tourism as before, there's no revenues, people have lost a lot of jobs. And this is, the Arab Spring was part of it to get a better living, and this has not happened. And this is why people see that maybe it's not such a success as hoped or expected when it happened.
Yeah, some people are talking economically about an Arab winter, aren't they? Is there any country in the region that you think the Arab Spring is considered to have been a success?
Well, certainly not Libya, but if you look at Tunisia, many Egyptians see Tunisia as maybe the one with the least losses, if you can call especially loss of lives or violence. It has not been as troubled as in Egypt. You had two uprisings, two presidents being ousted in the last 3 years, and that has pushed the country back a while. But many Egyptians see the current situation in Egypt as much more stable than the last 5 years at now, and the outlook is much better. But all in all, Tunisia is seen as the more successful story than the rest of the Arab Spring.
Yasser Hakim in Cairo, thanks so much for that. And joining me now from Oxford is Tariq Ramadan. He is Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies at Oxford University, and he's the grandson of Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. Welcome to the show, Professor. First question, from Tunis to Tahrir Square, we are still seeing the effects of the so-called Arab Spring. Where are we in that process, and what unleashed it?
Look, I was quite critical at the very beginning, and I said just when things were happening, I'm cautiously optimistic, because I thought that we were too quick to say it's a revolution, things are going to change. If you know the story and the history of Egypt, you know how powerful was and remained the army in the country. So where we are now, it's a state of regression. There is no freedom. It's again the dictatorship where people have been put in jail. I was very critical with the Muslim Brotherhood in power and running, and I wrote a book about this, saying how much they had to reassess their political vision and dealing with education, the economic stability. But we cannot accept that because we were critical, at the end there is a coup and there is no freedom. They are in jail, and the people are suffering from the lack of liberty, the lack of dignity, and poverty and corruption is still the situation in Egypt today.
What forces were unleashed? Because in the Western media, for example, you saw lots of sort of liberal activists in, for example, Egypt and Tahrir Square, but also the Muslim Brotherhood, very much part of the uprising in Tahrir Square. I was actually there and impressed by their amazing organizational skills. So were there competing forces that are still trying to work themselves out in the region?
You know, at the beginning, it was quite clear from all the liberal forces, the secular forces, and the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamists, even the literalists and the Salafi, where there was one target and one objective. They were all against the dictator. The problem is that the power of this united front at the beginning became a weakness just after, because then the Muslim Brotherhood, who came very late in the process, at the beginning they were not involved in all the uprising, and it were coming from, you know, the people of the organization of the 12th April and the 6th April, sorry, and also other organizations, secular organizations, young people on the ground. And then at the end, with the elections, what we saw is that there was a vision against the dictator, but not a vision for the future of Egypt. And then there were competing forces. What we should avoid saying today is that the only people who are against the dictator or against the regime are not only the Muslim Brotherhood, and what happened in Rab'a, for example, are not only the Muslim Brotherhood. I think we should be very much aware that some of the people, liberals and secular, are in jail today, and all the people who were within the movement at the beginning, some of the leaders are in jail and they are tortured and there is no freedom. So it's not only a polarization between the army in power and the Muslim Brotherhood, it's also the civil society that is suffering, and many leaders are just now struggling against the dictatorship.
Most say, with perhaps the exception of Tunisia, from sort of Libya to the Levant, these forces haven't been able to deliver on the promise of the Arab Spring. In your view, apart from the reaction by what you've called the deep state in Egypt, regionally, was there a lack of, for example, institutions and stability and processes by which this could have developed into meaningful reform?
Yes, I think that we have to look at the civil society, and we have also to blame. It's very important to blame the dictatorships and to blame what is happening, but it's very important to be critical about the forces that were involved in removing the dictators, because they were powerful against. But as I said, what is the political vision? And you cannot, and even in Tunisia, because today we say, okay, there was no violence in Tunisia, but what is the situation in Tunisia? The coming back of more security. Again, we have a problem because of the terrorist attacks. It's not a success so far. We have to wait for that. But what I would like to see in the civil society, in the Arab societies, and it's true in Libya as it is true in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Egypt, it's something that has to do with going beyond the polarization between the secular forces and the Islamist forces. We need to deal with politics now. What is the educational strategy? What is the economic strategy? What is the way and in which way they want to deal with corruption? We have a very simplistic, superficial and dangerous polarization between two political forces, but at the end, when you question their political project, their political vision, you see that there is not so much here that you can build with. And at the end, the dictators are playing with the divisions, and the corrupt regime or the armies are playing with this, and the situation is not moving. So we cannot only blame the West for that or blame the dictators. We also have to deal with intellectuals and civil societies and institutions that are not there and not. Of course, it's very difficult when there is no freedom. But when the uprisings came, we would have expected something like this to happen, and it didn't happen.
I'm glad you brought up the Western intervention aspect, because some outsiders have seen, and insiders have seen, the Western response when it came to Egypt as very muddled, finally dumping Hosni Mubarak and then backing elections and then moving against the Muslim Brotherhood when they were ousted. In Libya, for example, a humanitarian intervention which led to the ousting of Muammar Gaddafi, but of course then very little follow-up in terms of nation building, and we see the situation today, almost a split state. Where does Western intervention play into the hopes and then perhaps the dashing of hopes in the Arab Spring?
Yeah, the point here is that as I said, it's a co-responsibility. It's not only coming from within. It's true that just before the Arab Spring, it's normal to question how and why, for example, Western forces or powers were supporting the dictators Ben Ali in Tunisia, or even they were quite silent and bringing back Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and dealing with Mubarak. And then after what happened in the coup in Egypt, being quite quick to accept the situation and to deal with the dictator. So we should blame the civil society, but we cannot just avoid saying and analyzing the situation and say, if you really care about freedom, if you really care about democracy, you should be consistent with the governments you are dealing with. And it has to do in many levels. If we are serious about democracy, we should be serious about some of the trends and the ideologies that we have in the Gulf states. We also have to deal with the army and not supporting the army, because the question in the Middle East is not only about stability to protect our geostrategic interests and our economic interests when it comes to Western power. It has to do with the dignity of the people. And I think that we cannot deny and we cannot avoid saying now that the response coming from the West, it's not enough when it comes to supporting the democratic process and sometimes being silent when people are killed. I was the one who was saying from the very beginning, you should not be silent when people are killed in Syria. I also is one of those who was saying we have to be very cautious and say that what is happening today in Yemen, it's very dangerous with all the civilians being killed. So I would like more consistency with our the Western foreign policies.
But it's also regional, isn't it? The hopes and dreams of the Arab Spring, some have been hijacked by regional interests. One only has to look at what happened in Syria, and we see a regional divide in proxy support in the region in the civil war, and a similar case in Yemen. Has the Arab Spring dreams been sacrificed on regional security interests?
Oh yes, I think that we cannot just if we witness and we look at what is happening now for the sake of geostrategic interest, very often we let things happen and even people killing each other. It's very cynical, and I would say that once again, I always say this. I'm not happy with the Western policies there coming from the state and coming from Europe, but I'm also very critical with the Arab countries and the Middle Eastern countries, and even the scholars or the intellectuals or the people who are, or even the media who are not doing the job, and we keep on playing the victims, where at one point it's also something that has to come from within, because at the end the divide, for example, between Sunni and Shi'i is something which is now played on and multiplied in a way which is not acceptable. We are all Muslims, and we cannot just come to these types of very dangerous divisions that are not helping us to deal with the priority issues that we have to deal with. It has to do with freedom, it has to do with no corruption, it has to do with human dignity, and it has to do with justice in the region.
Tariq Ramadan, where do we go from here then? Because the forces unleashed by the so-called Arab Spring are still with us. We have a very young population in many of these regions who are connected to the world in very different ways from their parents and grandparents. The literature rates are high. Women are starting to have careers and not get married as early. Yet there's the appeal on one side of secular liberalism, but also on the other side of groups like ISIL. Where are we going with this?
I think it's very difficult. I cannot predict. I think it will take time. It will take 10 years, 20 years to start again a process where what we should expect and what we should hope is for the young generations now to understand something which is important. When I wrote the book, The Arab Awakening, I was saying it might not be revolutions, but at least something change, which is this awareness that we can change history. We can make history. So what what we should and hope is for young generations to come with more mobilization, more involvement in social activism, and to try to have this civil society again, and to resist any type of corruption, and to come together. More unity, more education, more social involvement. But to tell you the truth, I don't see this happening now. If you look at Egypt, with I don't know how many thousand people are in jail for political reasons, and they have done nothing, and there is torture and corruption and dictatorship. You see at the disorder that we have in Yemen, you see what is happening in Iraq, and add to this the violence factor with these so-called Islamic State, Daesh, that are people who are in the name of Islam are criminals,
Right.
and we have not only to condemn, but we have to combat them. And then if you look at all this, unfortunately, we cannot see but a destabilized Middle East for years now, and some making money out of this chaotic reality in the region.